Hi guys, it's Summers here and welcome to Development Diary. In this episode we're going to predominantly cover the Mercedes W10, a car that arrived at the first test in a very different specification to what we've seen arrive at the second test. And so what I really wanted to do was grind those details down into something a little bit more manageable and obviously show you what has actually changed. Now, if you are new around here, don't forget to hit the subscribe button down below so that you can get hold of my content as soon as it goes up. And also, if you go on to enjoy the video, don't forget to hit the like button, as that also helps massively as well. Okay, so moving on to the Mercedes W10, and as we know, the car that arrived at the first test is very different to what we're seeing right now. And there's changes up and down the car, not just in one particular area. The amount of changes is almost tantamount to a B specification, the sort of thing that we normally see teams introduce around the Spanish Grand Prix. So it just goes to show that the first test was all about mileage for Mercedes and working out all of the kinks, trying to get test mileage under their belt. So let's take a look at what has actually changed. Okay guys, so let's start at the front of the car, and clearly we have the new front wings for 2019, a design decision taken by the FIA to reduce the scope of the tools that the teams have in terms of creating what we call outwash, which is whereby the teams use the front wing to create a flow structure that pulls airflow that is turbulence that's created by the front tyre away from the bodywork at the rear of the car. In doing so, that obviously improves the performance of the car in its entirety, and so the teams are eager always to do so, but the FIA have tried to step in to prevent this. Now, the rules haven't perhaps gone as far as was required, because the end plate position has actually probably helped the teams to improve the outwash effect, even though they've lost a lot of the furniture that they can place on top of the front wing. So I think it's important that at this stage we remember that all of the teams will have their own approach to this outwash problem. And there are clearly at the moment two schools of thought. We have the Mercedes on one end of the spectrum, and then we have the likes of Sauber on the other end of the spectrum. And neither you can really consider to be right or wrong at this stage. But what I do think is we'll see some convergence at some point. One design will sort of bear out as the better solution, and we'll see other teams moving in that direction as they try to understand that and get the best from it from their simulation tools back at the factory. Now, in regards to the Mercedes front wing, the one that arrived on the launch car and at the first test featured a end plate that kicked in towards the rear, whereas everybody else had gone in a very different route. They were using the end plate to create the outwash. It was, their end plate was forcing airflow out and around the tyre. The Mercedes version 2 that has arrived at the second test is very much in that vein of thought as well. Their end plate now kicks out at the rear end, and it's joined by a little notch that's been created in the trailing edge of the end plate, something that's reminiscent of the designs that we see featured at the rear wing, and something we also saw arrive on the Williams FW42 when they arrived at testing at the back end of last week. Now, that's not the only change on the front wing for Mercedes. Obviously it will be important and everybody will talk about that, but we've also seen that they've changed the footplate design, which is the little arch section on the outside edge of the front wing itself, and that obviously will change the vortex that is shed from that area. We've also seen that, more importantly in my opinion, that the strakes have also been moved to correlate with everything else that's going on, which will reposition the core vortex that's formed underneath the front wing and help with this outwash effect that I've just been talking about. There's also changes to the top flap and the adjuster and slot gap separators, as they obviously clearly help to manage the airflow over the wing and create this outwash across and around the front tyre. Okay, so obviously we've covered the front wing now, but there's other elements of the front end of the car that I think we need to concentrate on. One of which is the nose, which has changed quite dramatically in its shape. So the front element of the nose, which Mercedes are kind of in their own school of thought again with, is that they carry a wider front nose tip. And theirs has changed shape in order that it funnels in towards the cape, which is set out just behind it. And the idea of that obviously is to help improve the flow structures in and around that area of the car. Just tie it in with the cape and help the flow managed around the chassis itself. I think something else that's important in that particular area of the car, and is a development that we're starting to see appear on other cars as well, and I think the entire grid will jump upon at some stage, is that obviously the front brake ducts are supposed to be very much a simplistic area this year, and that isn't going to be the case. The teams are going to try as hard as they can to make and improve ways in which that the air moves around that area of the car, because otherwise you end up with turbulence that can affect other items downstream. So what Mercedes have done in this case is they've created a sort of indentation to the brake duct itself, the vertical fence, in order that it's not all in line with where you would assume it to be on the vertical plane. And then that allows these winglets to occupy the space that's left over. They're very small, but they will make a difference to the way that airflow moves in and around that particular region, and hopefully help with the turbulence that would otherwise hurt the structures downstream. The team have also made improvements to the vanity panel that's got the S-duct outlet on top of it. They've actually introduced what we used to term as horns on the chassis panel there, and what they're doing is just flanking the S-duct outlet to help to draw the airflow through. Obviously the airflow comes from underneath the nose and up and over that crest, and they're just trying to define that a bit more with this particular solution. And also, because of the way these horns are actually shaped, they will also induce their own sort of streamwise vortex that will continue down the car, and I think that those are there with the intention of helping to improve the characteristics as the airflow moves towards the halo, which has obviously caused an aerodynamic problem for the teams since its introduction. I think it's important at this stage that we back up a little as well. Let's get the car in reverse and also have a look at the nose, because that again is an area whereby we can see the amount of time that it's taken to develop a concept of this magnitude, and the amount of time that it takes to get something of that importance through a crash test. It's not the making of a moment. That sort of thing does take weeks on end to try to get into your schedule. So it's clear to me that Mercedes always had this run plan in mind. They were always going to run the first test in that particular specification, and then come to the second test with something much more aggressive, and move onwards from there. Okay, so then we move on to an area of the car that has actually seen a huge amount of development work being undertaken by the team since the new rules in 2017. And the rule change for 2019 will do little to curb that. All they've realistically done is reduce the height capacity of what the teams can do with the barge boards, unless of course you were Ferrari and Red Bull, who found a way to get around that by reducing the width of the chassis itself. But that's for another video. I have covered it before, and I'll cover it in more detail after the test. But in terms of the barge boards, I think we really need to try to define them into different areas these days, because there are so many surfaces for us to talk about. They're no longer just a barge board in their own right. In terms of the update that Mercedes have bought for the second test, their rearwardmost element of the vertical part of the barge board has been altered so that it has more slots in there, and they are much longer in order that the airflow moves down there more effectively. In front of that, we see that they've added a new boomerang winglet, which basically is curved over from the top edge of the vertical element, and then curves around towards the side pod deflector. It's a very neat design. It's two elements, and obviously that will help the flow move down the car in the direction that the team are looking for. But where perhaps Mercedes have spent most of the time in that area of the car is not actually on the barge boards themselves, but on the chassis winglets that sit on the side of the chassis. So there's now two of them rather than one, and the forwardmost one is a very convoluted winglet in its shape, and tries to divert the airflow down towards the second winglet, which itself has been extended in length and also pushes downwards quite dramatically compared to how it did before. Now what they're trying to do there is encourage all the airflow that's moving around the side of the chassis to move down around the side pod's undercut. Now they've got themselves that side pod diverter underneath the side pod inlet, which is helping that migration of the airflow around the undercut. So they're making a serious attempt to divert airflow and improve the way in which everything moves around the side pod. And on top of that, they've also made a change to the forwardmost element of the side pod deflector. Now the deflector panel itself will help to manage the tyre wake, that turbulence that's created by the front tyre that I talked about earlier. When the tyre is actually in motion, when the tyre deforms, it creates turbulence, and obviously the teams want to reduce its impact on the likes of the side pods and also the floor beneath. Okay, so if we now concentrate on the floor, as we've got to that part of the car anyway, I think it's important to say that Mercedes, with their first specification floor, had already started to make alterations to this area. They'd added 3 additional short slots in front of the sort of chevron shaped tyre wake slots that they'd already got present in the floor last season. So they're already making waves in terms of trying to improve that area of the car. Now what they're doing by adding all of these slots on the edge of the floor, which are legal based on the changes that were made to the regulations for 2017, they're not actually slots either, which is quite an important difference in terms of the way that the airflow reacts to the surface changes. So they're actually fully enclosed holes, something that was re-allowed back into the rules in 2017. Prior to that, the rules required you to have a slot, which meant that the floor had a perforation on its edge, and that kind of reduced the slot's effect. So these fully enclosed holes are actually now more effective than they were back when we just had the slots ahead of the rear tyre. And what the teams are trying to do with all of these slots is basically improve how the air rolls up around the edge of the floor. They're trying to create sort of an air skirt in order that they seal off the edge of the floor, stop the ingress of the outwash that will try to come back in and be re-ingested into the flow, and also change the way in which that the airflow strikes the rear tyre. Much like they do with the front wing on the front tyre, they're trying to do the same at the rear of the car. And basically what they're doing there is trying to create another air skirt around the edge of the front of the rear tyre, in order that you don't get what's called tyre squirt, which is where airflow laterally pushes out off of the sidewall of the tyre and gets ingested by the diffuser, robbing it of performance. So they're trying to reduce all of those effects with these slots that are ahead of the rear tyre on the floor. And for the new specification floor, they've enhanced that even further by adding these little 3-element winglets on the edge of the floor as well. So that's encouraging the airflow on top of the floor to merge with the vortex that's being created beneath, and enhance that flow structure in its entirety. And obviously then that doesn't only improve the localized flow around the floor itself and help the flow migrate around the side pods, it also improves the entirety of the car's yield and helps to improve downforce and reduce drag. Okay, so now we've talked about the side pods, we may as well get onto them, and they are, in their midriff, extremely tighter than they were in the first specification that we saw at the first test last week. The team have made a huge leap forward in terms of wrapping the side pods in closer around the rest of the assembly work that's inside the bodywork. So we've got all of the ancillary coolers, etc., that live within the side pod. Now, obviously, you want airflow not only on the outside of the side pods to be improved by this, but also improve the cooling capacity inside. So there'll be a trade-off between cooling efficiency and aerodynamic efficiency in that respect. So we may actually see throughout the season, depending on where the teams are visiting, we may actually see them switch between these two variants in order that obviously they have the cooling parameters that they require for the power unit to get the power that they need, and also the aerodynamic characteristics they need for the likes of the high-speed circuits as well. Okay, and then we have another couple of winglets to talk about. The first one being the Halo winglet. Now, in the first test, the team arrived with just the streamlined version of the Halo, but for the second test, they've arrived with a couple of boomerang winglets that sit atop the Halo itself and help to manage the way in which the airflow moves over the top of it and down the flanks of the Halo. Now, Mercedes tried various solutions last season in terms of the furniture that sat in and around that area of the car. So this year again, I think we will see them make changes, but this at the moment is what they've opted for the second test, and will just help to manage the airflow around a structure that realistically is quite damaging to the airflow in that region. And then behind that, just on the back of the engine cover, the team arrived at the first test with just a singular element T-wing. Now it had some variation in its chord, the chord length, and it also had some variation in the geometry of the flap itself. The central part being at a different angle to the outer parts, and then it had a couple of sort of end plates trailing off the end. But the version 2 specification is a twin element version of the T-wing, with 2 of these elements there to guide the airflow, create downforce, and also obviously help to stabilise flow ahead of the rear wing. I think you'll agree that that covers the bulk of the updates that we've seen at the first day of the second test of testing out in Barcelona. But what I also wanted to cover was an update that we've seen both Ferrari, the works team, and also Haas adapt for the second test, which is the replacement of the wastegate solution. They've replaced the twin outlet solution that Sauber are still running as a Ferrari powered team with a singular outlet that is obviously bigger to accommodate the rules that surround that particular area of the car, and that is now above the main exhaust outlet. It's a design that we've actually seen before. Renault used to do something very similar back when only a singular exit was required of the regulations. So it'd be interesting to see if they're the only ones that do that this year, or whether other teams decide that that could be an option for them too. As I said earlier in the video, I really hope you've enjoyed the content. If you have, don't forget to hit that like button because that really helps me out. You can also subscribe to the channel by hitting the big red box that's below the video, and also follow me over on my social media channels. I always use the same handle, which is SummersF1.